Thank you for joining me today. I'm sure if you've watched a number of my videos, when you see me sitting in a chair like this, we're probably safe to expect a pretty compelling interview. And today, I'm going to interview a therapist who is an expert in trauma, but not just betrayal trauma. She is an expert in childhood sexual abuse, childhood trauma, childhood wounding. And what she's going to do today is educate all of us on how our childhood experiences and our childhood trauma actually can make things even more difficult when we're trying to heal from infidelity or addiction. So strap yourself in. Today is going to be very helpful, very educational. Typically, I have to give a warning that says today could be very triggering, but actually today I think you are in very good hands. In fact, I know that you're in great hands because this therapist, Amanda, who you will just meet, is someone who's actually helped me work through my own childhood sexual abuse and childhood sexual trauma. Yes, that's right. I have just told you I've been through that. And I understand the complexity. I understand the need for compassion. But not just the need for compassion, the need for expert care. And so today you're going to meet an expert. And I really believe, both unfaithful and betrayed, you're going to hear some insight today that's really going to set you free and maybe even change the course of your own personal recovery. So thanks for joining me today. So I did an off-camera that you didn't see introduction, but for the viewing audience, why don't you share a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what your main focus is as a professional?
I am a registered clinical mental health counselor. I have my master's in clinical professional counseling, and I specialize in betrayal trauma, trauma bonding, infidelity recovery, and complex PTSD. And I have been through affair recovery myself. I started working with Rick Reynolds, the founder of Affair Recovery, about 12 or 13 years ago, and then eventually went to school to be in the industry myself.
The viewing audience may or may not know or remember that I've been through my own childhood sexual trauma, and you've helped me, another therapist has helped me. And in this world of affair recovery and healing from infidelity, I think a missing ingredient is an understanding of childhood sexual abuse, childhood sexual trauma. Would you agree with that? Would you agree with the fact that the road to recovery comes right through our inner child wounding and young adult trauma? I mean, talk a little bit more about that, because you've really helped me understand that at a whole nother level.
So one of the first things that I do with clients is have them go back to their childhood so that we can start to look for markers of traumatic experiences from their past, because we know that most marriage problems start between the age of 0 and 18. And if they aren't resolved, that's how we end up bringing them in the marriage. And sometimes, infidelity can be a result, or even compulsive sexual behavior, lots of things. So what we have learned over just the past 5 years or so with the way that we can image the brain is that if you have a childhood that has childhood sexual abuse or other kinds of child neglect or abuse, that changes the way the treatment plan is built for recovery of the couple and individuals.
Like we talked about, trying to heal from infidelity is daunting enough. Like for the betrayed, of course, and you've lived through that, but also the unfaithful. I mean, it is overwhelming. So do you get pushback from people, or do you feel like, is there a reason to really kind of go backwards and investigate that stuff? Does it help, or does it bring up more collateral damage that it's like, this is hard enough, why do we need to talk about this stuff?
So it's important to go back into the client's childhood to see if there are traumatic experiences that are coloring or filtering or putting obstacles in the way of recovering from the affair. And one of the ways that I know that we really have to go back is the level of resistance that a client gives me when I start to ask them to talk about their childhood. A lot of times there will be minimization, or there will be this really intense response to how going in the past never helped anybody, what happened there happened there, or everything was fine in my childhood. They get defensive, they get agitated, or sometimes they just shut down emotionally and disassociate. And then I start checking boxes like, okay, we got to go back.
So it makes total sense. What do you kind of see are some common indicators that, okay, a couple's dealing with infidelity trauma, betrayal trauma, but what are some markers, if you will, that make you go, I don't think this is, like some therapists, it's about forgiveness, stop talking about it, just move on. And it's like, hold on, that doesn't work. But what are some factors that also make you go, this unfaithful or this betrayed is tapping into some very deep wounding from their childhood? What makes you as an expert go, okay, hold on, the road to recovery is not just 3 little steps, right? There's more to it. So what does a couple do or an individual do that's watching right now that needs to maybe be told, hey, you're dealing with more than what you see on the surface?
Some of the signs would be not taking direction, arguing with me about what my clinical direction is going to be, arguing with me about whether or not I'm giving them an opinion instead of giving them a treatment plan based on, the research that we know and case studies. So just general lack of cooperation, where if the unfaithful spouse is being very uncooperative and indignant, or they will agree in session, but then when they come back the next week, they haven't done anything that I've asked them to do. So they're avoiding. And so I know they're avoiding something. And the same thing with the betrayed spouse. If they are, telling me to my face, yes, I'll do this, I'll do that, but then they don't do it. I know there's reasons. There's something driving their lack of motivation and their avoidance of getting into the work. And they heal so much slower. I was healing so much slower than the peers that were with me in my groups. And that was why.
I want to be real careful because we all heal at different speeds, and we deal with the nuances of infidelity different. So just because someone's kind of going slow, that doesn't mean, hey, you're a mess. You've got childhood trauma. But it's interesting because I know about your practice. You have a full client load. You see a ton of people dealing with infidelity and addiction. But it's interesting that you just said when someone's taking a long time that it actually might be tapping into more than that. So talk a little bit more about that, because I think that's important.
For example, when I first started with Rick Reynolds, I was in all of your affair recovery groups. And I started to notice the difference between other betrayed spouses or other unfaithful spouses, because I got to be in both groups. And they could easily adapt the information. They could assimilate it, they could integrate it, and then they could make choices based on it. It didn't mean that they still didn't have to deal with pain and sadness and grief, but they had a grace and a flow to it that I didn't have. So then when I went back and I asked Rick, why are they getting better faster? And he said, because you have complex PTSD from childhood, you have developmental trauma, you have chronic relationship trauma, abuse, childhood sexual abuse. They don't have that. Your brain, when you image it, looks different than theirs. So you have to be patient with yourself because it's going to go slower.
Okay, so you just laid a lot out there. And I think it's important to take this moment. So, okay, I'm going to branch off topic here. So you just shared a lot of stuff that you've had to wrestle through. So what is life like for you now? And take off the therapist hat for a minute and talk about, okay, what is life like? Have you healed from that stuff? Do you feel like you're whole and healthy? Do you feel like you're a mom and an individual who feels very secure and healthy?
Most days. And if I don't feel like that, then I have other people that I reach out to who understand how I need to be grounded specifically. Like Rick trained my whole family system how to help me. And then the people around me from recovery also knew how to help me. So it's still more difficult than someone who has a typical brain. But I love my life and I can relate to people in a way that people that haven't been through the amount of trauma, they don't relate. And that actually is what makes me a good counselor.
I love that. No, I love that you just said, so I'm a therapist, I do my job, I help people, I'm constantly trying to give back, but you have your own care team around you. And I love that because I have trouble trusting a therapist that has it all figured out, that doesn't have, that isn't getting therapy themselves. Because would you agree that we don't come to the point where we're like, we're healed, we're done, and here's our papers, and we just move on. But that also, and I want you to talk about this, that also doesn't mean that we are just a train wreck for our whole lives, that we never get our life back, that if we've been betrayed or if we've been unfaithful, that we don't ever come to a point where we're like, no, I'm healthy, I'm strong. However, I'm still working through stuff because I haven't arrived, right? Would you agree with all that?
I am a huge proponent of maintenance. So I don't graduate my clients. You can go into maintenance, so maybe come once a month, once a quarter. But the truth is that life is always happening. So for me, when I became a betrayed spouse, that blew the top off all of my complex PTSD from the time I was 7, which was when I was sexually abused. From that point on, you get to places where you're doing really well, but then another thing happens because life happens. And so then you already are still in the flow with your counselor because you still have touch points. You still are using your recovery team and the relationships that support you so that you're safe. You don't go as far down and you don't totally regress, because if you have another situation where trauma happens, we know trauma triggers trauma. So it might not come up with the intensity, but it's still going to activate stuff from the past that's wounded me.
I find that to be, I think you're hitting the nail right on the head, but let's give the audience an example, because I know there came a point for me where I was wrestling with infidelity stuff, and it was like I kept hitting a wall. And I hit this point, and I had to talk to you, I had to talk to another therapist and go, what is going on inside of me? Because I just can't make this leap, or I can't connect the dots. And it was so frustrating, but it was also so painful for me. And getting unlocked by the right people really changed my life. I had no idea that it wasn't necessarily just infidelity, it was childhood stuff that I've had to work through and I've experienced in a ton of healing. But maybe you can give an example of when a person is dealing with this childhood trauma that they can go, okay, that helps me make sense. And at the end of the day, that we can also be a little bit more kinder and compassionate upon ourselves, because we're masters. If we're abuse victims or neglect victims, we're masters at shaming the heck out of ourselves, right?
When you land in counseling, the first thing that we need to do is build rapport and trust and a therapeutic alliance. When we suspect that there is developmental trauma on top of the acute single incident trauma, which is the infidelity, and then multiple cases of relational trauma in their history, we know we want to be with this client for the long haul. We're going to go slow and steady, but we know that their freedom is going to come off in layers. As they complete one layer, which first would be the infidelity recovery, then that might get into the next layer of relational or childhood. So for me, for instance, when I was in graduate school, I took combat PTSD and I wrote a paper on how childhood sexual abuse plays into that. It triggered me. I went to Rick and said, I'm losing my mind. What's happening? Like, I have all this rage. I'm starting to be really oversensitive. And so that's when we started to get into my childhood sexual abuse. Now, mind you, this was years after he had helped me with the betrayal trauma.
If I put it together, what I hear you say is, and I say this too, but we've just had you as an expert say, basically, sometimes the reward for your healing is more work, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I learned for me is I would do a lot of work and heal, but then I would see things totally different and go, oh, so now I see what's happening on a deeper level, right? Because I've hit this point of healing. It doesn't mean, and I don't want to paint a negative picture, there is a point where you hit some healing and you're like, oh my gosh, I feel amazing. And then you're like, but wait a minute, now I see this totally different, right?
It can be scary for a client for a couple reasons. we suppress things that happen to us in childhood, and you know this from having to do the work also, because it's a defense mechanism. And so you know that it happened, but you don't know that it happened. You're never thinking about it, and you're always thinking about it. It's a very strange experience. So once you get to a level where new things come up, it's actually your subconscious saying, okay, we feel safe enough, we trust your counselor enough, you're taking care of yourself, you're taking care of us enough that we can now address this. Then it can be scary because it can change you as a person. It can change your relationship. It might mean your partner needs to level up and your partner might not want to level up. It can change your whole family system because now you're going to be setting boundaries differently or communicating differently. Your expectations are different for emotional intimacy and safety. So it can be daunting and you have to be ready for it. So we say when it comes up, then you're ready for it.
So now I'm going to ask you something that I have noticed in our kind of work that we do in this field. Trauma bonding has become a huge topic of discussion. And it has been for a long time, but it's now become more mainstream. And, you know, if you are looking at infidelity, there's betrayal trauma, which has become a hot, phrase, but trauma bonding is become a really huge phrase. So for the layman that we are kind of sitting here going, what is trauma bonding? Educate us. What is a trauma bond?
I'm going to use a couple case studies to explain it. I have one couple on my case that 2 years I've been working with them. They come in, he's the unfaithful, she's the betrayed. I give them the betrayal trauma and the affair recovery treatment plan. They both do some family of origin work, nothing major. They knock it out of the park. They're on maintenance. Then you have a situation come in where there is complex PTSD. You have the betrayed spouse who was sexually abused when they were younger. They are continuing to stay in a relationship with their spouse who has had an affair but is not doing the work. They're not safe. They're not responsive. But this client keeps staying with them. Why? Somebody who's healthy would say, you have two options. You're either going to go and do the work and level up with me, or I'm out. But that person that can't leave. That's trauma bonding. What happens is, so for me, I trauma bond to my perpetrator when I'm 7. So I fuse abuse and attachment. So then if I get into a situation then in the future, which of course I did, where it's not a healthy environment, I'm working, my partner's not, but I can't get out. I'm psychologically anchored like a hostage because I haven't dealt with the original trauma bonding. So now I'm trauma bonded in this marriage too.
That was probably one of the best and easiest descriptions to understand how trauma bonding is. What does someone do? The word you used, hostage, was compelling. And I think there's so many betrayeds out there that probably are like, oh my gosh, that is exactly what I feel. So I know you can't go into this long, drawn out plan, but just some essentials. What is a person who's male or female that's dealing with a trauma bond? What do they do? How do they find freedom?
First of all, it can happen on both sides. So you can have a betrayed spouse who is trauma bonded because they haven't dealt with their childhood abuse, neglect, the attachment issues. Or you can have an unfaithful spouse who is trauma bonded to their betrayed spouse who is stuck. They won't get better. They can't stop the verbally lashing out. They can't re-engage. So you have to work with a counselor who understands complex PTSD from the start. Even if you don't know if you have complex PTSD, betrayal trauma so oftentimes is related to complex PTSD because infidelity can be a byproduct on the unfaithful or the betrayed side, that it's just, in my opinion, smarter to start there, because then in the future, you don't want to be switching counselors because you need the rapport to go that deep. Because for someone who is struggling with trauma bonding, if they have to exit an abusive relationship, you feel like it feels like a death because it's connected so deeply to the past that has to be addressed too.
And I think that we who deal with childhood trauma, not always sexual trauma, but just childhood trauma and abuse, we feel like the world is spinning out of control we feel completely abandoned. We feel so alone. We can have a million friends, we can have an army of close friends, but we just feel so alone and we feel overwhelmed. And I think we just struggle to find any hope or find safety.
The insidious part of trauma bonding with regards to that is then we subconsciously go back into fantasy where other people can see what's happening in the relationship and that it's unhealthy, but we necessarily aren't fully out of denial because we don't want the relationship to end. We want our partner to get better. So fantasy is how you survive when you grow up with a lot of childhood neglect or sexual abuse. You just kind of create your own world. So I see it way before my clients see it. And that's how it happened with me too. So you have to respect the speed that the client's going, or you can throw them into a psychotic break because it's just too much. And yeah, the hopelessness is, it's dark.
Well, this has been a great session. Thank you for taking me through my own personal session for all the world to see today. So how do people find your website? Tell them a little bit about your site and if they want to learn more about what you do.
So my website is healingaffairscounseling.com. I'm out of Tampa, Florida. I am open to answering any questions that people have. It can be confusing. This is a lot. This is the deeper side of, what we do. So not everybody walks this path, but I'm always happy to help give referrals and help people find good help too.
When we produce this video, it'll be on YouTube and several platforms. So for those of you that are watching, if you have questions, and if you can obviously keep it a little bit short, but if you do have questions or there's things that you're struggling with, I'm going to ask Amanda to comment on these YouTube videos because some of this stuff, it really takes an expert that understands, because the last thing that any of us need is the wrong type of help when we're dealing with this type of pain and hurt. So Amanda, thank you so much for coming in. We're gonna have to do another one because we barely scratched the surface, and I think that this is a missing link to infidelity and trying to move beyond the pain of it because it taps into so many other pains. So thank you so much for coming in today.